Saying no rarely feels like a single word. It feels like bracing for impact, like something you have to recover from. And if you've ever walked away from a boundary that was completely reasonable, yet still felt heavy, guilty, or unsettled afterward, there's a reason for that. And it has very little to do with whether you were right. Most people assume that saying no feels hard because they're unsure, or because they're being unkind, or because they secretly want to say yes. But for many people, the discomfort comes from something else entirely. It comes from what saying no activates, not from the decision itself. Because when you say no, you're not just declining a request, you're interrupting a pattern. And patterns, especially relational ones, don't dissolve quietly. For a long time, your role may have been to smooth things over, to be flexible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to absorb disappointment so others wouldn't have to. In that role, connection was maintained through accommodation, and safety was tied to how little friction you created. So when you say no, even calmly, even respectfully, your body doesn't interpret it as neutral. It interprets it as risk, not because something bad is happening, but because something familiar is no longer happening. The nervous system doesn't measure correctness. It measures history. If, at any point, disagreement led to withdrawal, or disappointment led to distance, or asserting yourself led to being misunderstood, then no became associated with loss, not logically, but somatically. That's why the heaviness often shows up after the boundary, not before. You say no. And then comes the wave, the replaying, the wondering if you were too harsh, the urge to explain, to soften, to make sure the other person is still okay. That impulse isn't weakness, it's conditioning. Because in many relationships, saying no didn't just set a limit, it shifted the emotional balance. And not everyone knows how to sit with that shift. Some people respond to no with curiosity. Others respond with pressure, with disappointment that lingers in the room, with subtle signals that something is now off. And if you've learned to be attuned, those signals are loud, even when no one says anything. So the heaviness isn't about the word no. It's about what happens around it. It's about the silence that follows, the change in tone, the sense that you've introduced something that now needs to be managed. And this is where many people get stuck. They start measuring their boundaries by how well others receive them. If there's no pushback, the boundary feels valid. If there is pushback, it feels questionable. But that logic quietly hands your clarity away. Because boundaries aren't confirmations. They're information. They reveal where you end, not where others agree. When saying no feels heavy, it's often because you're still carrying responsibility for what the other person feels next. You're monitoring their reaction, reading the emotional temperature, bracing for a shift you might need to fix. That's not boundary setting. That's emotional labor, continuing under a different name. And it's exhausting. What makes this especially difficult is that the people who feel this weight most are often deeply considerate. They don't want to harm. They don't want to be selfish. They don't want to create unnecessary distance. So they hold the discomfort themselves. They assume it's theirs to process. But here's the quiet reframe. Discomfort doesn't always mean something went wrong. Sometimes it means something changed. And change, even healthy change, can feel destabilizing at first, especially if you're used to being the stabilizer. Saying no asks a different question than we expect. Not, was this acceptable? But, can I tolerate not managing what happens next? That's where the real weight is. Because letting a boundary stand means allowing others to have their reactions without rushing in to soften them. It means trusting that disappointment does not equal danger and that silence does not automatically mean rupture. This doesn't require force. It doesn't require confrontation. It requires presence. The ability to stay with the discomfort without interpreting it as a signal to undo yourself. Over time, this is what lightens the heaviness, not by making no feel good, but by making it feel less dangerous. You don't need to convince yourself that your boundary is justified. You already know that. What you're learning is that your nervous system can survive the pause that follows, that you don't disappear when someone is disappointed. That connection doesn't always collapse just because you didn't comply. And the more you allow that space, even briefly, the less weight no has to carry. It becomes a boundary, not a threat, not a rejection, but a reference point. And slowly, without forcing yourself to be braver or louder, you stop measuring your choices by how little they disturb others. You begin measuring them by how honestly they reflect you. That's not hardness, that's self-respect. And that's often where the heaviness starts to lift. Not all at once, but enough to let you breathe.